You're listening to The Stories Your City Forgot, where overlooked people, places, and ideas take center stage, and history gets personal. I'm Justin Mattson. Today's episode takes us to a divided Germany, East and West, democracy and communism, but through a lens we rarely talk about, women's rights. This is a story of subtle rebellion, unexpected compromise, and how gender equality got caught in the crossfire of the Cold War. With that in mind, let's let today's guest introduce himself.
I'm Alexandria Ruble, and I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Idaho. I've been here since 2023. And a couple relevant details. I grew up in Virginia, and I bring that up in part because there's a German-American connection there that got me interested in my research, which we can explore a little bit in a few minutes. And then I went to college there, and then I decided to go to graduate school, and I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to work with some of the big-name German historians at the time, like Konrad Jarausch, Karen Hagemann, and Christopher Browning. Then I spent a couple years working in the South, and then I came to Idaho. So
kind of a journey there, getting to Idaho, right? You've written an incredibly fascinating book on a topic I don't think I ever would have considered, which is what I love about this series. Tell me a little bit about, give me 1 second, I'm going to pull up the actual wording of the book. Entangled Emancipation, Women's Rights in Cold War Germany. Fascinating. How did you give me an overview of what this is about and kind of how you became interested in this topic?
Yeah, so my first book explores this topic of women's rights in East and West Germany. And specifically what I'm interested in is, in the book, and what I'm arguing is, in this post-war period, in 1945, everything is in shambles. Everything's destroyed in Germany after World War II. They call it the 0 hour. And from this point on, then, one of the many, many areas of society that has to be rebuilt, of course, is legal rights, civil rights. And there are a bunch of women's rights activists who come out of the woodworks after World War II, particularly after being suppressed by the Nazis for 12 years, who say, look, society has been destroyed. This is a chance for us to rebuild. And why not rebuild with, a new sense of what equal rights for men and women could look like? That could be part of our new society. And part of their reasoning behind this was during the war, so many men had gone off to the front. Women were on the home front. It was the women who were taking care of their families, who were also working full time usually. And we're really carrying that double burden or even triple burden. So after the war, they're like, look, we sacrificed a lot for this country. The least you can do is give us some sort of equal rights. But then, so they start having these discussions about how they're going to reform this. And of course, part of that discussion, what my book specifically looks at, is family law, because prior to this point, the law in Germany had been very patriarchal. Men could make all decisions for their wives and families. No-fault divorce was not a concept that they were familiar with. And so the women start saying, this might be an opportunity to make that law more equitable in this post-war environment. Well, but then the Cold War hits, and it splits Germany into East and West. And all of a sudden we have these two different ideologies that are using women and gender as this battlefield in this new Cold War world for who's going to give women rights first and give women more rights. So that's what my book really explores, is how they take this particular law, the marriage and family law, and then pursue very different paths with it throughout the 1950s and 1960s.
That is incredibly interesting. Because I think when we think about World War II, I think a lot of our focus is on the Nazis, but, there are families and people that are coming out of this crushing period of strife, significant strife. What are the two ways in which, the Cold War, how do they take this family law in those two directions? What are the two directions that you kind of look at here?
Yeah. So, as we know, after 1945, Germany is split into 4 occupation sectors. There's the Soviet zone in East Germany, and then the 3 Western zones, French, British, American, and West Germany, that eventually become, I would argue, mostly American dominated. They eventually unify, but it's those two that become East and West Germany. So they're, to some extent, very much influenced by those different ideologies. But I don't want to say that it's just a top-down thing that's coming from either side. That's just to say that in East Germany, because it becomes a communist state under the eye of the Soviet Union, for them, what we would think of as gender equality or women's equality is supposed to, in theory, play out in all areas of society. It's supposed to be equal wages for men and women. It's supposed to mean equal child rearing. It's supposed to mean no fault divorce, right, where neither side is considered the responsible party. You can go down the list of things. How that plays out in reality is a different story, and that's part of what my book explores too, is that the everyday life perspective it's not always as equal as we might have wanted. In West Germany, so that East Germany in many ways, because they're working with the Soviets, are looking at this as it's very future facing. We don't have to return back to these old ideas. We don't have to turn back to this traditionalism that had defined our society before. West Germany goes in the complete opposite trajectory. There, it's initially the Christian Democrats who come to power, and I should preface that by saying, too, that at that point in time, right, the Christian Democratic Union, that has a very different connotation than it might in an American context. They're a center-right party. They're not, they're not particularly extreme in any way. But the Christian Democrats, they say, our response to this post-war situation, our response to the war, is to return to those traditional Western values, the things that undergirded our society before the Nazis came to power and ruined it with their extremes. So they see, for instance, traditional gender roles as being a way for Germans to obtain some stability, right? To go back to what's familiar, one might argue. And part of this, too, of course, is a response to their anti-communist regime, to what's happening in East Germany on the other side of the border, to say, the communists are doing this. Well, we don't want to do what communists are doing, so we'll do the opposite. And of course, the communists are saying, well, we don't want to do what these outdated West Germans are doing, so we're going to go in a more progressive direction. And so one of the things that I explore throughout the book is that it's not just that they're having these dialogues within their countries, but they're actually looking at newspaper articles, legislation, cases from the other side and saying, well, we don't want to look like them. We want to be different, right? And using that to push forward some of their debates.
That's really interesting to look at another side's legal briefs and go, not this. That's really interesting. What do you think the when you look at the two of them, what did the everyday life between the two groups look like? So what did it look like under the Christian Democrats, and then what did it look like under the eye of the Communist Party? I'm really interested to know what it felt like to kind of be these people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was one question that I was really interested in, and the short answer is it's complicated.
As it always is.
Right.
It always is a complicated situation.
It is always complicated. And part of that has to do with one of the things that I explore a little bit is how people interact with laws, right, in a general sense. To what extent do people really abide by a law, right? In our basic, if you think about just in our everyday lives, how many times have you jaywalked, right? Technically it's against the law, but a lot of people tend to ignore those sorts of things. And so, one of the questions I had coming into this was looking back at this patriarchal law. This dates back to 1900, by the way. So, I mean, this is a law that has been on the books for quite a time by the time we get to the 50s and 60s. And I'm wondering, well, do men really make all decisions for their wives? I mean, what's really going on here? And what I found, and I did this mostly through looking through sociological surveys that were taken in the late 40s and 50s, but also letters, accounts that are written to newspapers, is that it's a really mixed bag in terms of what average Germans, and that applies to East as well as West Germans on both sides of the border, are doing. And a lot of this relates to their religious backgrounds. A lot of it relates to their social milieu or their socioeconomic status. What I found through reading these surveys were they're asking them questions like, how I don't know, how authoritative is your husband in the family, or who does most of the roles, or who does the laundry, right? Those sorts of things. Is that there's a certain percentage of Germans who say, we follow the law, that's what it says, this is how our life is structured. But there's also a pretty large percentage that are like, we don't pay any attention to that. We just do what feels right to us. He likes doing laundry and I like cooking, so he does the laundry and I cook, right? In some cases, they also reflect on the post-war realities. There's one particular example that I looked at where prior to the war, this is one couple had followed very traditional gender roles. After the war, though, he comes back and he has what we would think of as PTSD, and he's physically injured. And after that, they both say they pursue a more egalitarian kind of family and marital model, simply because he wasn't the same person that he was before, and he couldn't do the same things that he could before. He couldn't work, right? So there were things that they had to do. She ends up going out and working, and he ends up taking care of the household stuff because, well, that's what he's doing, because he's home all the time. So there's some really interesting cases like that. There's some cases where it is ideological, where you might have kind of farther left social democrats who say, this is who we are politically, this is what we believe in. But it seems to me like across the board for most Germans that it can be really hit or miss depending on how much they're really applying this law. So then the other question for me, once I figured that out, was, okay, if the law doesn't matter that much, then if nobody's following it anyway, if it's just sort of this archaic thing, then why does it matter that they passed the reforms in the 50s? I mean, why are these women's rights activists, and other people too, so up in arms about it? And that's where the other side of everyday life comes into play, is that when we're thinking about court cases, for instance, you might have a marriage that's going swimmingly for 20 years. Something happens, maybe your kid has a crisis, you have a disagreement about it, you have to take it to court. And that's when the judge can step in and say, well, the husband has the right here because that's what the law says. And it doesn't matter if it was egalitarian up until that point. It doesn't matter if the wife had made, 19 out of 20 decisions. And so that's kind of the point that I wanted to explore a little bit too, is like, what does this mean for people's everyday lives? And the fact that that's always hanging over their heads, that this, there might be a point where that could dramatically change it. One great example of that is there's actually a case of a disagreement over what to name a baby. So, yeah, and it goes to court. I mean, the father wanted one name, the mother wanted the other. They could not agree. And they both had their reasons for why they were going to do that. And they go to court, and the judge ultimately upholds the husband's side because that's what the law says. But then you're thinking, well, now this woman has to go through life calling her kid by a name that she doesn't want to, I mean, that's like a big thing, right?
Yeah, should the state be allowed to step in and then grant the name of a child is a really, like, it's almost on the nose that it would be on like a dystopian novel, right? Like almost like some sort of Amazon show where they're like, the state is overreaching all the time.
Right, yeah. Or like another example, which is pretty heartbreaking actually, it was from a diary, or like kind of a memoir piece that I had found in an archive. And this woman, so under the law, right, men can make all decisions. So that means that like if he wants to take a new job and move the family across the country, that's it. Like they can go, right? She can stay put, but right, he can still take the children and go. So this really puts a lot of women in a bind. So I have this one case of a woman, that's exactly what happens to her, is her husband takes a job that actually ends up moving them around like 6 or 7 times. She has no choice in the matter. If she does decide to stay where she is, she's going to lose her rights to her children. So she kind of has to go if she wants to be with her kids. And what she reflects on in this diary is just how lonely and isolating it was, because she had no friends. She didn't know anyone in these cities. She had no one to help her with her kids. And they no sooner got settled and he would accept a new job offer, right, and get moved somewhere else. And for her, they did eventually get divorced in the 1970s under a new divorce reform. And that's when she kind of becomes liberated. But she says for her, like the fact that he could make that decision without any input from her basically ruined her life. And it was also really bad for her children as well, because they had no stability. So those are the types of things that I'm looking at here to really think about how is this affecting people's everyday lives.
Yeah, and I think it kind of comes to a broader topic of, this is a conversation that wasn't just happening in the Germany, right? This was a conversation that we were having globally, in the United States. It's very fascinating to see it out of the Cold War, under the Cold War microscope. What did it look like for you to go in and research these pieces? Where did you start with the legal briefs and then work your way to the memoirs, or what did your research process look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I more or less did just as you described, starting with the legal briefs. So this project had actually had its origins in my undergrad years, and I had been looking into how the American occupation dealt with German women because there was a so-called surplus of women, like 7 million more women than men. Um, and with that, because I noticed that a lot of the women's groups that I was looking at for that thesis were talking about family law for my master's thesis, I decided that I was just going to work on the West German side. And so that's where I started to look at the legal briefs, some of the parliamentary debates. And what those then led me to, in part, it was a very organic process. As I started reading through parliamentary debates, I was like, oh, they keep mentioning this East German family law. That's interesting. And so I started there, started to look at the different political parties, trade unions, different women's organizations, different professional organizations that were really invested in these issues. And then from that point on, once I had all of that established, I started to look more into the newspapers and the diaries, memoirs, sociological surveys, and so forth, to get me into that side of things.
Yeah, I think it's a very natural arc to go on, right? You start with what are your senators and representatives saying, and then you work your way down. I guess, was there something that really surprised you during your research? Was there something where you saw that and you just went, "Oh boy," right? Like, what was that? Was there a moment like that for you?
Yeah, probably several moments. Although one of the standout examples of that is comes up in one of my chapters, is trying to understand specifically how East Germans dealt with these issues, and I think our assumption, particularly as Americans, is East Germany, particularly because they're working with the Soviet Union, it's going to be a communist dictatorship. West Germany is, because it's modeled after the Americans, is going to be like a very functioning liberal democracy. And I'm not arguing against that. I mean, that is definitely true. However, what really surprised me was that to see that, the East German dictatorship was sometimes a little more malleable or a little more open to public reception than one might expect. And the West German government was sometimes more authoritarian than we might expect. Um, so this particularly comes up with the issue of churches. So at this point in time, the late 40s and 50s, the religious denominations and churches still have quite a bit of power, in particularly in West Germany. They're run by the Christian Democratic Union, which maintains very close relations with Catholic and Protestant leaders. But in East Germany, which is primarily Protestant, a little bit of Catholic, at this point, a lot of people still identify as being a church member. Now, what that means in terms of actual practice is a totally different thing, but nevertheless, right, they identify that way. And this means at this point in time that the churches have a lot more power, and maybe society's not quite as secular as it might be today. So in the case of East Germany, when in 1954, the government basically issues or starts publishing its newspapers drafts of the forthcoming family law. It's very egalitarian, so on and so forth. And they think, the East German Communist government thinks that this thing is a go, right? That it's going to pass. They're going to beat the West Germans to the punch. They're going to have this new family law. Men and women will be equal, and that'll be that. What they don't expect, so what they do is they set up a series of public forums that summer. And the idea here is you're going to send out a Communist Party representative to basically give a rundown of the major points of the law, and people can ask questions. It all appears very democratic, right? This is actually a way for the government to kind of gauge what are the issues that people are most interested in, right? So there's still that element of communist control, right? But it also allows people to voice their complaints. So over the next 6 months or so, East Germans voice their complaints. They take advantage of this. But what's particularly interesting is it's not just average East Germans, but it's churches that raise their points about how, technically speaking, under the East German constitution, they're supposed to be allowed the right to worship. They're supposed to be allowed the right to not to have too much state intervention in their child rearing. Now there's this new family law that basically overrides that, and that they feel like their rights are being trampled on. That's all to say that by the end of about the 6-month period, East German government is quite riled up, particularly by the churches. What really, I think, kind of puts the nail in the coffin is the churches start to talk about German unity. So it's the issue that riles them is not so much that the churches are like, oh, there's government intervention, but rather when they start saying, well, if you do this, you're going to ruin our chances of unifying with West Germany, and you will be responsible for causing more division. And that's the point in East German government memos and so forth that they really harp on is they can't say that about us, right? They can't say that we're the ones who are divisive.
We're saving this country right now, right?
Exactly.
The state has to believe that the state is in the right.
Exactly, right? And so they just quietly shut it down. They're like, we'll return to this issue of family law later on. They don't pass the legal reforms. They don't do anything to the churches. A bunch of churches petition. Their leaders go out to the pulpits and are like, this law is terrible. Don't follow it. And they don't do anything to them. They do keep an eye on them. They tell the Stasi to kind of start watching them, but that's about it. Nobody's punished for this. Now, in West Germany, it's the opposite trajectory. The churches think they've got this in the bag. They've met with Christian Democratic leaders. They are so convinced that the Christian Democratic government is going to just go along with their wishes to have this more traditional family law, and that ends up not happening. There's enough resistance from women's groups, from trade unions, from different professional organizations. The West German government says, we're also going to put a little pause on our legal reforms. And we're not going to go right in this sort of harder line direction because we really need to reassess what it is that people want, what's the most democratic way to do this, what's really the best thing for our new liberal democracy. So that surprised me too, because the chancellor at the time, Konrad Adenauer in West Germany, he's a staunch Catholic, he's a staunch Christian Democrat, and he was really angry about the fact that these reforms were not going the way that he wanted. And so he tried to shut it down. He tried to silence some of the groups that were opposing him, but it didn't work. So and weirdly enough, in 1954, both sides end up kind of putting a pause on these legal reforms, in part because members of their societies were pushing back. And so, yeah, that as I was reading through those documents, I just wasn't expecting that at all. I totally expected, the East German communists were going to win and West German Christian Democrats were going to win, and they ended up not getting what they wanted at that point in time.
What do you think it was that because you mentioned the churches? Why do you think the churches had so much power? Is it we're coming out of this war period and people are turning to faith? Why do you think these churches had so much power to be able to make their claim in family law and say you guys cannot do this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things going on there. I think in terms of if we think about the longer trajectory of political power in Germany, dating back to the 1870s, there had already been, for instance, the Catholic Center Party, that represented a movement that's now known as political Catholicism. So that had already been well embedded in their society. Later on, during the Weimar Republic, there's a number of Protestant parties that pop up. And there's a number of different Protestant denominations. So some Protestant parties, they're smaller and they are linked to those. But the important thing to recognize is that there's already those religious affiliations that are involved in German politics from a very early stage. So there's that side of it. There's the Cold War context to consider as well, that if you have this kind of atheist communist government in the East, then what you want to emphasize is the opposite of that. So you want to demonstrate that there's a freedom of religion that's allowed in your society, part of its tradition. So I think there's a number of different things. And I do think, like you mentioned, for some average folks, this is the idea that, things have been so unstable. The Nazis had there's a lot of strange things going on with their relations with Christian leaders. But in any case, there's a sense of, well, this is a return to what we already knew before 1933. And so, this is an opportunity to return to that faith, to return to some of those traditions that were not allowed, or were not allowed to flourish, right, over the last 12 years.
That's really interesting. And so, where does your book go next when it's examining family law? So you have this kind of rebellion from your churches and your people saying, your family laws are not going to work for us. And then they go back to the drawing board. Where does that go next? How does the fight for civil rights conclude here?
Yeah. So in the case of East Germany, it essentially just goes back into the government. There's a number of subcommittees that are ostensibly looking at it, but one of the important things that I explore during this period too is it's 1954, so this is the late 50s. This is a period when we're starting to see some of the clamping down, particularly from the East German side, of movement of their citizens. The Berlin Wall goes up in 1961, so we don't have to worry about that yet. But nevertheless, the border is starting to be patrolled more during this period. And that's what really, I think, in some ways kind of occupies their attention. And it really is this issue of German unity. There's this period in the late 40s and early 50s where no one really knows, right? I mean, we know that Germany's divided. We don't know that Germany's going to be divided until 1990. It's really not clear at this point in time. It only starts to become clearer throughout the 1950s that this might be a semi-permanent division. And so it's also during this period that I think East German government officials, recognizing that, it's like, okay, you've got these people who are fleeing over the borders. You've got these churches that are alleging that we might be the more divisive Germany. And then they start to realize, there might be some real hiccups here. I mean, if we do end up with two different Germanys that are formally separated, what does that mean for people who are divorced or have children, right, on the other side? There's one case I explore where a guy, he's actually in West Germany, and he writes to the East German government. And he's like, look, I'm divorced. My wife and my kid live in East Germany. I want to pay my alimony and my child support. How do I do that? And the East German government's like, well, we don't accept West German money, so I guess you can't pay your alimony. And all right, and he's trying to do the right thing, right? And
right, yeah. It's interesting for the state to go, no, your money is no good. Your child and ex-wife starve.
Right, yeah. And I mean, eventually they, as we have found out later on, they do accept lots of West German money surreptitiously, right? It's just he can't send it. But and so there's cases like that where I think in the late 50s, the East German government officials sit down and are like, we really have to figure out how we're going to handle these kinds of issues. So that's a lot of what they're doing behind the scenes, is just hammering out what is our stance going to be on this. The construction of the Berlin Wall then changes that, right? Because that kind of gives them a lot of freedom to do whatever they want, because their citizens can't flee over the Berlin border anymore. And it's kind of the same for West Germany. It basically goes back into parliamentary subcommittees for the next 3 years where people hash out the legalese. And there's another round of protests that are not quite as vigorous as they were in the early 50s. And that's simply because most of those issues had already been hashed out. And this is a matter of just getting the wording right. And so what happens, ironically, is West Germany does pass their law first in 1957. It's not as far-reaching as maybe like West German women's rights activists would have wanted. It does get rid of some of the major issues, like a husband's right to decide. So they're happy with that. But at the end of the day, it's a compromise. So for instance, a husband can't make decisions for his wife anymore. He can continue to make decisions for the children. That's later overturned in a constitutional court ruling, but at this point in time, that's the compromise. It's like, well, he still gets to have paternal authority. He just can't have that authority over his wife, who is another adult. How does that play out? Well, there was one woman I was talking to, and who was she must have been in her 80s or 90s. She was up there, but she was basically a teenager during this period. And she was like, well, my father got to decide what my major at university was going to be, and he decided I was going to be a teacher. So he chose what university I was going to and like what kind of training I was going to get. You know, so that's what happens in West Germany. East Germany ends up not passing a full reform until 1965, but when they do, it's extremely, like, it overhauls all this old patriarchal stuff. Like, every single part of that law says men and women are equal in household chores. They're equal in child rearing. They're equal in this. They're equal in that. But it does take them a little bit longer to get there.
And what's going on the liberal side of this coin? How are they moving forward with their family law bills?
Yeah, so there's really at one point in West Germany in particular, there's really three different bills that go before. So there's the center-right party, the Christian Democrats. There's the center-left party, which are the Social Democrats, and then there's a classically liberal party called the Free Democrats, and they all put forward different drafts that, in many ways, if you look at the language, they overlap in some areas. So they're not really that different in the end. So the center left and the liberals, in many ways, they do agree on a lot of basic issues from the get-go, such as getting rid of this patriarchal right, no fault divorce, and so forth. In some ways, they're a little bit different. Particularly, and I won't get it too much into the weeds, but when it comes to like marital property and property scheme, the classical liberals tend to be much more in favor of like, we should all have rights over our property, those sorts of things. But yeah, so there's a couple different strains of thought that are going on there.
That's interesting. And you mentioned you talked to someone who had their life impacted from that. What was that experience like to be able to talk to them about their life?
It was incredible. It was also totally random. I was in Koblenz, which is where one of the federal archives is located, and I was waiting for a while at a bus stop, and this old lady was standing next to me, and she turned to me and she asked me a question. I think we must have been staying there for 20 or 30 minutes. The bus didn't come, and she immediately picked up my American accent and asked me what I was doing there. Koblenz is not a huge city. And I explained, I'm a historian. I'm working on this project, and I'm going up to this archive. And that's when she was like, "Oh, let me tell you about my life," and just like unloads this whole thing about being a teenager in the 50s and how her father could choose what she was going to study, and like she liked being a teacher, but she recognizes that this has changed the whole trajectory of her whole life because she never had any choice over the matter. And yeah, so we just ended up having like this 30-minute conversation. It wasn't formal. Don't know her name or anything like that. Yeah. So
just at the bus stop, you got some family lore.
right. Yeah. So I wish that I had a recorder or something and could have taken down her information, but it also just goes to show you, right, that this is an issue that does affect people, right, in this really visceral way. That she was like, I'm going to spend 30 minutes of my life telling this American about this, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's important for your right as a person to be able to make decisions that are ultimately right for you. And you heard the story of a woman who did not get that chance to make that choice until much later in her life, which is still good, right? Like, at any point you should be able to make a change in your life, but she wasn't allowed to make that choice. When somebody reads your book, how does your book, what is the kind of core message you like for them to kind of take away from it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things. One, that when we think about the Cold War, I don't know what your high school experience was like, but for me, it was all like space race and arms race.
I think that's consistent. The
Yeah.
space race, the arms race, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's very America centric. It's not, or at least mine was very American centric. I'm sure that there are other programs that are very excellent and worldly.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of, I think, even when I was in college, kind of this idea that I was going in with, like, oh, the Cold War was this stalemate for, whatever, 50 something years. And it was defined by the space race. And honestly, I didn't find it that interesting until I took a college class on it. But I think what really draws me to this demonstrates just how much the Cold War permeated every part of life. That even thinking about some of my earlier work on how the Americans were dealing with German women, they would actually send these German women on exchange trips to the United States where they would go observe how American women lived. Oh, look, they have these giant refrigerators and these appliances that help them get their housework done. That is embedded right in this Cold War framework of you want that. You don't want to live under a Soviet style system where you don't have this. You want this American style consumerism, right? And capitalism and liberal democracy. And so I think that's one of the big things is to demonstrate just that the Cold War infiltrated everything, right? Every area of culture and society. It wasn't just a military or a diplomatic conflict. It was much more than that. But the other thing, like I alluded to before too, is thinking about everyday life is just that that for both East and West Germans, right, that this is something that did affect them on an everyday level. And that in some ways it wasn't that different on both sides of the wall. I mean, yes, the laws were different, but some of that traditionalism didn't disappear. Even in East Germany, 60s and 70s, we have cases where, if a young woman gets pregnant, her parents say, well, you got to marry the guy. Technically, the law doesn't mean that at that point says you don't have to do that, right? But there's still those traditional values that are still present. And it doesn't matter what the law says, right? People are going to stick to the cultural values that they grew up with, right? What they're used to. Same thing in West Germany. So maybe that even though they're in these different societies, that they weren't that different after all in some ways.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I think it's fascinating that they brought German women to the United States. I think we would call that soft power in the political sciences, right? Like the culture war, right? Like that's what we're talking about, the Cold War culture war of you want to live like Americans. Americans are the best. We're so awesome, right? And it's funny that it's big refrigerator and not we treat our people well, which is fascinating. I want to thank you so much for bringing this topic to me. I think it's really fascinating when I get to talk to people about a subject that they study. If people liked what they heard from you today and they want to know more, where can they find more of your work?
Well, they can certainly go to the University of Toronto, University Press, Amazon, right? The book is cheap. There's even some used versions I've seen recently that are up for $5. So, they can find it. They can find the book there. I've published a couple articles too, but the book's probably the easiest way to go.
The definitive source. Are you working on anything else right now? Anything you've got in the pipeline?
Yeah, so I've started a new project, and I'm looking at political prisoners that were imprisoned under the Nazis and what happens to them after 1945 and how they reintegrate themselves into society in East and West Germany.
I want to thank Alexandria for bringing us the hidden history of women's rights in Cold War Germany. It's a story that reminds us that behind every treaty and standoff, there were real people trying to live real lives, whether it was naming a child, choosing a career, or simply trying to stay with your family. The fight for equality wasn't just political. It was deeply personal. I'm Justin Mattson, and this has been a story your city forgot.